A girl clocked out of her shift and then disappeared without a trace. Not long after, the case turned into a mess of contradictions, bizarre leads that went nowhere, creepy anonymous calls, and eerie parallels to other vanishings in the same area. More than once, it looked like detectives had finally cracked it, and every time, the story found a way to flip the script. 41 years later, they finally got within reach of the truth, and the ending turned out to be nothing like what people expected. Theresa Fusco was born on January 18, 1968, in Long Island, New York. She grew up in a small town called Lynbrook, one of 3 kids in the family. Her parents eventually divorced, and her dad moved to New York City, but Theresa and her siblings still went to see him all the time. From the time she was little, Theresa was all about dance, especially ballet. It wasn't just a hobby for her. She really pictured a future in it, either teaching or one day performing on New York stages for real. By the mid-80s, she was in high school, and she had this easy way of making friends. She quickly ended up with a big, tight circle around her. When she was 16, she picked up a small part-time job at the snack bar inside a roller rink, not far from her house. It was only 1 day a week, just a little extra money, because the rest of her life was school, dance, and chasing the kind of future she'd been dreaming about for years. On Saturday, November 10th, 1984, Theresa headed to her shift like she always did, getting there around 5:30 p.m. She was supposed to work late, then stay at a friend's place, and the next day she planned to go into New York City to see her dad. But the night started going sideways almost immediately. First, she got into an argument with her boyfriend. Then, she clashed with the assistant manager at the snack bar. He chewed her out for not wiping down the tables well enough, and the whole thing escalated so fast that, right in the middle of her shift, he fired her. As a result, Theresa broke down crying, and around 10 p.m., she walked out of the building. The next morning, her mom went into Theresa's room and noticed something that didn't sit right. The bed was made, and on the floor was the suitcase Theresa had started packing the day before for her trip to her dad's. Her mom knew Theresa had planned to sleep over at her friend's house, so at first she assumed that's where she still was. But when she called the friend, she actually found out that Theresa never showed up. That's when her mom started to panic. She began calling Theresa's friends one by one, and nobody had seen her. Nobody had heard from her since the day before, so she immediately went to the police. Officers spoke to Theresa's coworkers and learned she'd been fired that night. A few staff members said they saw her leave in tears at around 9:47 p.m., but after that, no one could say where she went. From the very first days of the investigation, police decided Theresa had probably just run away, upset after getting fired and fighting with her boyfriend. Because of that, they basically didn't search for her at all. They just assumed she'd cool off and eventually come back home. Theresa's parents completely rejected that idea, and they were furious with the police for doing nothing. Her mom kept saying she and Theresa were really close, and there was no way Theresa would just walk away from her family like that. On top of that, all of Theresa's stuff was still at home, even her cash. If she'd really planned to run, she would have taken at least the basics, and she definitely would have taken her savings. Theresa's friends didn't buy the runaway story either. Once they realized police weren't seriously looking for her, they started searching on their own, walking around town, checking places she might have gone, but nothing came up. And there was another reason this felt so much darker. This wasn't even the first disappearance in their small town. Less than 5 months earlier, a 15-year-old girl named Kelly had vanished, and the similarities were honestly creepy. For one, Kelly and Theresa had been close friends since they were little, until Theresa eventually stopped talking to her because Kelly had started hanging around a rough crowd. And second, the last place Kelly was ever seen was near a gas station less than a mile from the roller rink where Theresa worked. That night, Kelly had told a friend she was going to stop by a video store before heading home. But when police later talked to employees there, they said she never came in. And just like with Theresa, Kelly's mom found that she hadn't taken anything with her, not even things you'd expect if she was running away, like a recent paycheck from her part-time job. But despite all of that, police refused to acknowledge any connection between the two cases. Just like with Theresa, they were convinced Kelly had simply run away. And in Kelly's case, that theory didn't sound quite as far-fetched. She really was a troubled teenager. But after Theresa disappeared, a lot of people started questioning the whole "she ran away" explanation. Theresa's family also said she'd been really shaken by Kelly's disappearance, even though they weren't close anymore by that point. For weeks after Theresa vanished, her friends and relatives kept searching. They put up flyers, called around, pushed police to take it seriously and launch a real investigation. But nothing changed. And then it got even worse. Theresa's mom started getting calls from strangers who claimed they had tips about where her daughter was. But it quickly became clear most of them were just cruel pranks. One time, she even got a call from a girl who said she was Theresa and begged for help, repeating over and over that she couldn't breathe. That went on for almost a month. But on December 5th, everything changed. Two teenagers were walking near the railroad tracks, not far from the roller rink, when they spotted a human body covered with leaves and wooden pallets. Not long after that, medical examiners confirmed it was Theresa, and that she'd been killed by strangulation. She'd been dead for at least several weeks, which strongly suggested she was murdered the very night she disappeared. Her clothes were gone, and the autopsy found signs of sexual assault. Investigators collected biological evidence that likely belonged to the attacker, but at the same time, DNA testing wasn't available yet, so that lead couldn't take them anywhere. Now that it was undeniable Theresa hadn't run away, police finally launched a proper investigation. They questioned hundreds of men, basically anyone who knew her, and even some of her relatives. At one point, they had their first serious suspect, but they ruled him out pretty quickly. Later, when limited DNA testing became an option, investigators took samples from dozens of men, but they still didn't get a single match. And then, just a few months after Theresa's body was found, another young woman disappeared. This time, 19-year-old Jacqueline in a nearby town just a few miles from Lynbrook. It was the third disappearance in less than a year, and people in the area started asking the obvious question: was there a serial predator operating right under their noses? But police still couldn't solve any of the cases. It went on like that for a few more months, until detectives finally zeroed in on a 26-year-old man named John Restivo. When they brought him in, he admitted he'd known Kelly. And he also told them something else. At one point, he'd actually suspected two guys he knew were involved in her disappearance. Those two were 21-year-old John Kogut and 31-year-old Dennis Holstead. And once police heard that both men had previously been involved with Kelly, who was only 15 at the time, their attention immediately snapped to them. Because of the similarities between the cases, detectives started looking at Kogut and Holstead as possible suspects in Theresa's murder too, and they brought both men in for questioning. Dennis insisted he had nothing to do with it, but Kogut, after a long interrogation, started changing his story, and eventually he confessed that he was directly involved in Theresa's murder. According to Kogut, that night he was riding around in a van with Dennis and Restivo. Near the roller rink, they spotted Theresa walking along the road and offered her a ride. Once she got into the vehicle, the mood shifted. They started pressuring her to have some fun. Theresa refused and asked to let her out. That's when, according to his confession, the men attacked and sexually assaulted her, and then killed her. After that, they drove to the railroad tracks and hid her body nearby. After getting that confession, detectives arrested Kogut and turned their focus to the other two. But they ran into a major problem. There wasn't a single piece of physical evidence tying Holstead or Restivo to the crime. Both of them kept denying everything, and they flat out rejected Kogut's version of events. But then, the case took another turn. Police got a warrant to search Restivo's van, the same van Kogut said they'd picked Theresa up in. Inside, they found a black female hair that looked like it could have belonged to Theresa. An independent expert later said it was highly likely the hair was hers. Back then, they still couldn't run DNA testing on a hair like that, so the expert relied on microscopic analysis, basically comparing the hair's characteristics and markers, and the results lined up closely with Theresa's. With that new piece of evidence, detectives moved forward and charged all three men. Still, their attorneys immediately started pointing out a long list of inconsistencies. Kogut, the one whose confession kicked this whole thing off, tried to take it back almost immediately. He said detectives basically forced him into signing a false statement. According to him, they kept him in interrogation for more than 10 hours, pressuring him non-stop, threatening him, and even getting physical, all to make him confess. His lawyer also found out that Kogut had taken 3 polygraph tests, and all 3 times, the examiner didn't see signs of deception. But the lead detective told Kogut he'd failed all 3 anyway. And legally, police are allowed to do that. They can lie to a suspect to try to get a confession. They can claim they have evidence they don't actually have. Like, for example, saying someone's DNA was found at the crime scene, even if it wasn't. As for the confession itself, Kogut said the detective wrote it out by hand, read it to him, and then demanded that he confirm that's what happened. Kogut claimed that before landing on that final version, the detective had floated 6 different scenarios, but none of them worked to implicate Kogut and the other 2 suspects. It was only on the 7th attempt, he said, that the detective finally came up with a story that fit. By that point, Kogut said he was barely thinking straight, exhausted, sleep-deprived, and worn down. So he signed the statement and then read the confession on camera. After that, detectives brought him to the spot where Theresa's body had been found, but he couldn't point out any key locations. Even so, police still moved forward with charges. And there was one more thing. Kogut's girlfriend gave him an alibi for the night Theresa was taken, but investigators didn't buy it. Restivo had his own argument too. He insisted that at the time Theresa vanished, his van wasn't even drivable. He said it was sitting at his mother's house with no wheels, so there was no way he could have been cruising around town in it. His attorney even suggested the hair allegedly found during the search could have been planted by police because they were desperate to tie him to the murder and couldn't do it any other way. Despite all of that, the case against all 3 men still went to trial, and the court decided to handle them separately. In 1986, Kogut was tried first, and the jury found him guilty. He was sentenced to 31.5 years in prison. After that, it was Dennis and Restivo's turn. They were both convicted too, and each of them got 33 years. So officially, Theresa's case was closed. But all 3 men kept insisting they were innocent. Their attorneys kept fighting the convictions, and that battle dragged on for years. Then, starting in 1993, when DNA testing really started to become a major tool in forensics, investigators ran the semen sample taken from Theresa's body against the DNA of all 3 men, more than once, and every single time, it came back with the same answer: no match. But there was more. That hair found in Restivo's van, the piece of evidence that helped tie the whole case together, turned out to have its own disturbing twist. Later testing showed that the hair had been pulled from someone who'd already been dead for at least a few hours. That didn't fit Kogel's confession at all, but it fit the defense's argument perfectly, that the evidence may have been planted. Experts reached that conclusion because newer testing could detect structural changes in hair that only happen after death. Still, it took the appeals court 10 years to finally act on all of this. And it wasn't until 2003, nearly 2 decades after they'd been locked up, that their original convictions were thrown out based on the DNA evidence. Dennis and Restivo were fully cleared, but Kogel was ordered to face a new trial. It happened in 2005, and this time he was found not guilty too. After that, all 3 men filed lawsuits, accusing police of building fabricated cases against them. In 2006, Restivo and Dennis each received $18 million. Kogel got far less, just $1.5 million, because he refused to join their joint lawsuit. So in the end, their involvement in Theresa's murder was officially ruled out, and the case was wide open again. By that point, a new group of detectives had taken over at the local department, and they went back through everything from the beginning. Pretty quickly, they realized something frustrating. The original investigators had ignored key leads because they were so locked in on those 3 suspects. One tip stood out in particular. A man had come forward back then and told police that on the night Theresa disappeared, someone stole his car while it was parked near the roller rink. The car later turned up abandoned somewhere else, and inside, he found a pair of women's jeans that looked a lot like the ones Theresa had been wearing. But after he reported it, police didn't really follow up, and somehow, those jeans were lost. Now, 2 decades later, there was nothing anyone could do with that lead. Detectives also uploaded the killer's DNA profile from the semen sample into the FBI database, but it didn't match anyone. So the investigation stalled again, and for years after that, there were no real breakthroughs. That's where things stayed for years, until 2023, when detectives took another deep dive through the file, hoping there was still something they could use. And that's when they turned to a relatively new method that was getting a lot of attention. They still had the killer's semen sample in evidence, so they sent it to a lab that specializes in forensic genetic genealogy. The lab started searching public databases for relatives connected to that DNA profile, and eventually it led them to one family that had been living in Lynbrook back when Theresa was killed. And once detectives looked at the men in that family tree, one person fit the profile better than anyone else, a 23-year-old named Richard Bellotto. Detectives learned that in 1984, Richard had been living at his grandparents' house less than 2 miles from the roller rink where Theresa worked. And when police talked to people who remembered that family, more than one person said Richard came off as strange, detached, even unsettling. Nearly 40 years later, Richard was still on Long Island, about an hour from Lynbrook, working nights at Walmart. Investigators began quietly watching him, hoping to collect a DNA sample. Before long, Richard tossed a smoothie cup in the trash. Officers grabbed it, sent it to the lab, and pulled DNA from the straw. Then, they ran the comparison against the semen found on Theresa's body. It was a full match. In October 2025, 41 years after Theresa was murdered, Richard was finally arrested. During questioning, he wouldn't confess outright, but he did let something slip that made detectives' ears perk up. At one point, Richard said, "Back then, people got away with murder." And the detective basically shot back, "Times have changed, and you're not getting away with it now." Still, after his arrest, Richard pleaded not guilty. So now he's sitting in jail, waiting for trial. And with that kind of DNA evidence, it's hard to see a world where he walks away from this. The only question is how long the court process drags out. Sadly, Theresa's mom passed away in 2019, never getting to see this arrest. Her father is still alive though, and he spoke at a press conference thanking detectives for not giving up. So in a way, the case finally moved toward a real ending. But there's still one big question hanging over everything. Was Theresa's killer also responsible for the disappearances of Kelly and Jacqueline? Or were those separate crimes committed by someone else? Right now, there's no public information saying investigators have found anything that ties Richard to those other cases. The one thing they do know is that back then, Richard worked out of a mobile coffee van, meaning he could drive all over town and even beyond it without drawing much attention. And that's why some people worry Theresa may not have been his only victim. Most likely, we'll learn more once the trial gets underway. But for now, all anyone can do is wait. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments section, and don't forget to press the like button if you enjoyed my video. Thank you for watching.